All right, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on when you're watching this. This is going to be reading 3 of the Gateway Experience. Sorry about that, I forgot where we left off with the title. But this is the Brain Hemisphere Synchronization in Perspective, the Gateway Experience. And we're going to just go right into consciousness and energy. That's where we left off previously. And there's still a lot to go through. So I hope you're finding some of this useful. Consciousness and energy. Before our explanation can proceed any further, it is essential to define the mechanism by which the human mind exercises the function known as consciousness, and to describe the way in which that consciousness operates to deduce meaning from the stimuli which it receives. To do this, we will first consider the fundamental character of the material world in which we have our physical existence in order to accurately perceive the raw stuff with which our consciousness must work. The first point which needs to be made is that 2 terms, matter and energy, tend to be misleading if taken to indicate 2 distinctly different states of existence in the physical world that we know. Indeed, the term matter is taken to mean solid substances, as opposed to energy, which is understood to mean a force of some sort. Then to use the former is entirely misleading. Science now knows that both the atom and the nucleus itself are made up of nothing more than oscillating energy grids. Solid matter, in the strict construction of the term, simply does not exist. Rather, atomic structure is composed of oscillating energy grids surrounded by other oscillating energy grids, which orbit at extraordinarily high speeds. In his book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, Itzhak Bentov gives the following figures. The energy grid which composes the nucleus of the atom vibrates approximately 10 to the 22nd power hertz, which means 10 followed by 22 zeros. At 70 degrees Fahrenheit, an atom oscillates at the rate of 10 to 15 hertz. An entire molecule, composed of a number of atoms bound together in a single energy field, vibrates in the range of 10 to 9 hertz. A live human cell vibrates at approximately 10 to 3 hertz. The point to be made is that the entire human being, brain, consciousness, and all is, like the universe which surrounds him, nothing more or less than an extraordinarily complex system of energy fields. The so-called states of matter are actually variances in the state of energy, and human consciousness is a form of that interaction of energy in 2 opposite states, motion versus rest, in a manner described in the following paragraph. Holograms. Energy creates, stores, and retrieves meaning in the universe by projecting or expanding a certain frequency in 3-dimensional mode that creates a living pattern called a hologram. The concept of the hologram can be most easily understood by using an example cited by Bentov, in which he asks the reader to visualize a bowl full of water into which 3 pebbles are dropped. As the ripples created by the simultaneous entry of the 3 pebbles radiate outward towards the rim of the bowl, Bentov further asks the reader to visualize that the surface of the water is suddenly flash frozen, so that the ripple pattern is preserved instantly. The ice is removed, leaving the 3 pebbles still laying at the bottom of the bowl. Then the ice is exposed to a powerful, coherent source of light, such as a laser. The result will be a 3-dimensional model or representation of the position of the 3 pebbles suspended in mid-air. Holograms are capable of encoding so much detail that, for example, it is possible to take a holographic projection of a glass of swamp water and view it under magnification to see small organisms not visible to the naked eye when the glass of water itself is examined. The whole concept of holography, despite its scientific implications, has only been known to the physicists since the underlying mathematical principles were worked out by Dennis Gabor in 1974. He later won a Nobel Prize for his work. Laboratory demonstration of Gabor's work only occurred years later following invention of the laser. As biologist Lyell Watson explains, quote, "The purest kind of light available to us is that produced by a laser, which sends out a beam in which all the waves are of one frequency, like those made by an ideal pebble in a perfect pond. When two laser beams touch, they produce an interference pattern of light and dark ripples that can be recorded in a photographic plate. And if one of the beams, instead of coming directly from the laser, is reflected first off an object such as a human face, the resulting pattern will be very complex indeed, but it can still be recorded. The record, or the record, will be a hologram of the face." So I guess that a way to just whittle that down to something a little bit more tangible and referenceable mentally is how cameras would use flashes, and that flash would is basically saturating the scene, whatever it's looking at, whatever it's pointed at, with photons, and then those photons are then captured on the plate, the negative, and that's I'm going to assume that's basically a way to describe it, and probably how photography works. So it's with that said too, it's we've been basically in one way or another, through either deliberately or unknowingly, we saturate ourselves with all kinds of energy forms, and we don't necessarily know how they're affecting us, but we're using them. The part encodes the whole. Or further importance is the fact that even if we dropped our frozen hologram of the ripple pattern on the floor and broke it into a number of pieces, each individual piece would recreate the entire holographic image all by itself. The smaller the piece, the fuzzier and more distorted would be the resulting holographic projection, but the fact remains that a whole projection would be nonetheless made. The key to creating any hologram is that energy and motion must interact with energy in a state of rest, non-motion. In the foregoing example, the pebbles represent energy and motion, while the water, before its agitation by the pebbles, represents energy at a state of rest. To activate, or in effect to perceive, the meaning of a hologram, energy, in this case a coherent light source such as a laser beam, must be passed through the interference pattern generated by interaction between the moving energy and the energy at rest. In the simple example given by Bentoff, this requirement was fulfilled by holding the frozen interference pattern in front of the coherent light to project the three-dimensional holographic image, its meaning, into space. As Marilyn Ferguson, editor of the Brain Mind Bulletin, tells us, quote, "Another feature of a hologram is its efficiency. Billions of bits of information can be stored in a tiny space. The pattern of the holographic photograph is stored everywhere on the plate." That's a little bit sort of fuzzy to try to understand, but the notion here of rest and motion is that the pebble is energy that's being perceived as a solid object, and the water is energy that's being perceived as energy in a rested state. And I guess as long as it's illuminated by photons, the degree or energy or energetic, I guess, bandwidth of the laser or light determines the quality of information retained in that hologram or that picture. And that's just another way of saying too, right, how the lens on a camera, depending on how polished it is or the type of glass and how it's been crafted, how it captures those photons, how the quality of what it can capture and how many photons it can capture, right? Or as we know on a computer screen or a printed document, on a printed document we have DPI, which is dots per inch, and on a computer screen we have resolution, which is bits per pixel or pixel per bit. And it's essentially just, imagine a piece of graph paper and you shine a light on it, and you take a flashlight and shine it on your, a friend or something, or an object of a ball, and then the lens inside the flashlight basically has two functions. It is to magnify the light, and then also with a good mirror, project that light through the mirror back onto the graph paper. And then the graph paper, the quality of the negative, which is the graph paper, will hold that reflection. It will basically, in a way, sort of be burned or etched into the negative, the material on that. I think it might have been carbon. I'm not sure. I don't know what the negative plates were made out of on old cameras. They might have been magnetic, actually. So, and then each grid on that graph paper, what it can retain, you don't see the grid. It's kind of invisible, but then you can turn it on and look at each small square to see how much detail it captured on that lens or from that mirror as it reflected back onto the graph paper. So the way they're using hologram here is, I know most people are going to immediately think like a three-dimensional object sort of hovering somewhere without any technology or any other, like, for example, the ball, like the ball would just appear but may not be tangible. The difference here, and where I think people get mistaken with the term hologram, and also in this example, as the commander says, it's a simple example, is that the holograms aren't touchable, right? They're not physical. So in the case of the ball that I actually took a picture of, I can physically interact with it. So I don't, the idea here in a way is that my mind is keeping that ball together so that I can touch it. And I think that's how people translate it, where if I've maintained a certain ability or I get to a certain level of functioning, higher functioning in my brain, I could not only poke that ball and my finger go through it, but then immediately make the ball solid again and continue to play with it or bounce it on something else. And I think that's generally what people, whether or not they explain it the way I did, I think that's how most people interpret it. And the problem I would have with that example is that there is a material or a matteristic or physical component to how these atoms and nuclei are bonded together, and that's through fission and fusion, composition and recomposition, heat or cold, basically alchemy or chemical, an alchemical process. So I guess we'll find out in the consciousness matrix here as we go through a little bit more, but the notion of the hologram or hologram is a little bit confusing because people don't further elaborate on or define what the hologram is, because most people, I think, because of television and content and media, like I said, think that the ball is not physically there, and that if they're under the impression that I can make the ball basically disappear and reappear, right? Or at least make it transparent to where I can see through it and then make it solid again. So I think that's usually how people interpret it, and maybe we'll get a little bit more clarification as we go further. Oh, I pulled away from the microphone. Sorry about that. The consciousness matrix. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is, in and of itself, one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. According to the theories of Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, the human mind is also a hologram, which attunes itself to the universal hologram by the medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. That doesn't help anybody, I'm sure. With respect to states of expanded or altered consciousness, such as gateway uses, the process operates in the following way. As energy passes through various aspects of the universal hologram and is perceived by the electrostatic fields which comprise the human mind, the holographic images being conveyed are projected upon these electrostatic fields of the mind and are perceived or understood to the extent that the electrostatic field is operating at a frequency and amplitude that can harmonize with the therefore read the energy carrier wave pattern passing through it. Changes in the frequency and amplitude of the electrostatic field, which comprises the human mind, determines the configuration and hence the character of the holographic energy matrix, which the mind projects to intercept meaning directly from the holographic transmissions of the universe. Then, to make sense of what the holographic image is saying to it, the mind proceeds to compare the image just received with itself. Specifically, it does this by comparing the image received with that part of its own hologram which constitutes memory. By registering differences in geometric form and in energy frequency, the consciousness perceives, as psychologist Keith Floyd puts it, quote, contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be the brain that produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. I think without having a degree in physics or any of that stuff, again, the issue here is that we can see a physical brain. A surgeon can go in and see one. So statements like that, I think, immediately become misleading for other people. But if we're to believe and just open up a little bit to what is being said here, it's almost like saying that my brain doesn't exist until the surgeon opens it up and expects to see my brain there. Otherwise, it's empty inside, and I mean, there's nothing inside the skull. I'd like to expound on this paragraph a little bit and just kind of verbally talk it out, but I'm not having a full grasp entirely of what they're trying to communicate, other than what I've already reiterated or what I stated in the previous paragraph, is the electrostatic field of the human mind excuse me, is again, it's the power. What it would essentially be saying is we're already using our telepathic extrasensory abilities just from a default state in order to create what we already have now. Like, we're already sort of in a default mode where, let's just use the analogy of a blacksmith who is going to weld and solder and refine a series of metals and ores and shape them with a hammer into a sword or an anvil or whatever. The idea that's being presented here is that it's the blacksmith themselves, through the ritual and performance of the activity, that's crafting the sword, not the physical components of heat and pressure, and it can be confusing in that way, because I think that's how people are expecting it to translate. Like, that's what people expect is being said here. So it's very unapproachable for the common person like myself or anybody who may be listening to really grasp what they mean by that. But the overall premise then would have to be is, by default, what it could be is that everyone else is projecting, say a newborn baby enters the world and they don't see a sword for anything other than just a metal object. They don't know what its function is. They don't know what it's for. And it's only through interaction and other psychic interaction with other people, both in a physical level and the more esoteric level of words and spells cast by words, that the baby then perceives the sword as it was intended to be by its maker. So it's like saying, in color theory, in the graphic design realm, there's some statistical data that basically says women actually see colors 20% brighter than men. So not only do you have a literal perceptual issue for people, or a cognitive issue that's predicated on a biological function of the eyes, right? If it's the females of the species who see colors 20% brighter, and the men who see colors at the 80% rate less vibrant than women, you literally have a natural miscommunication, right? There's a wall there. And what happens with that is you can actually change the perception of that person in real time by making them mix the colors to match the expectation of the other person. So it's just basically saying if a wife picks a color, shows it to the husband and describes it and shows it to him, it doesn't mean he's actually going to perceive it the way the way she sees it. It's just not possible. However, if you line those colors up against a spectrum of other colors or shades and hues, and then they both mix colors together, there's a psychic occurrence occurring where they're working together through ritual and performance. And then there's the end result, the materialization of it, where they both say, okay, I see the color that you see now because I participated in it. But that could be what I would call psychic war driving, where in the case of, if we revert back to the child, the presence of the parents trying to describe what a sword is for and showing them how it's made is not only a physical experience, but is a psychic war driving experience as well. It's a programming through these electrostatic fields, these biofields that we all emit. And just let that settle in for a minute. It's you're literally forcing your mind, and I don't mean violently, but you're forcing your will through energetic states onto someone else. And in other cases, you're using ritual performance to allow their body to participate, whether it be mixing paint or forging a sword, in order to experience the object as well. So there's the physical experience of it, and then there's the psychic war driving of it. I don't know if what I explained is really mapping out what they're saying here. This is just how I'm interpreting it, because I'm still of the mind, and it's not materialistic, but it's just, there's just in the back of everybody's head, it's, well, I should be able to bend that sword down with my mind as well. And if it's really mind over matter, or they're both together at in synchronous harmony, and I'm only perceiving a sword because the sword maker told me it's a sword, and it's like reality could literally fall apart then, and the sword would just cease to exist if I got too confused or the sword maker themselves got too confused. I mean, it's like the atoms would just come apart and the sword would no longer be present. And if that's possible, let's just say that that's possible, that's exactly what they're trying to describe. What exactly is holding everything together then, right? What when I go into the store and want to buy a sword, excuse me, let me take a drink break here. If I go into the store and buy a sword off the shelf, what's keeping that one together then? Right? Is it's just my preconception that I'm going up to see? It's not. It can't possibly work that way, because what it would mean is I would have to have familiarity with that object already. I would have to know what to expect at least a little bit in order to go in and pick out the sword I wanted. I'd have to have a precognitive ability as well. Basically, I would be at home and be like, I'm going to go buy a sword, visualize exactly what I want, go to the store, and lo and behold, it's either there or it's not there. So there's a little bit more that could be expounded on that. I'm actually poking holes in this stuff because it helps patch up areas, hopefully for you or myself as we read this. But that metaphysical component, I think, has to be discussed or expounded on, because the general perception is like I said, that at some point someone was at the level or the mind of capacity where they could make the sword emerge out of nothing or make the sword disappear, and we would all be subject to that, either by psychic war driving or by just perceptual, being there to see it happen. And then in the case would be like, well, how do you know the other minds that are watching it aren't keeping the sword together and then hindering your power to make it dissipate, make it disappear or dissolve? So and that could go into the theory of everyone working together and trusting together, and literally just looking at a table and saying, I want to manifest a roll of tape. Everybody work with me. Well, what's the tape look like? This, and what's on it? This, what does it do? This, what is it? Blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, and all of a sudden everybody concentrates and boom, the tape appears on the table. So if that's possible, then, obviously all of us are pretty far behind on the curve if people are doing this somewhere. If it's being misconstrued by myself, please feel free to offer some insight or commentary. But there's similar ideas and notions in more esoteric and ancient texts. The hologram and holographic universe is not a new concept. The commander is not inventing something. He's not using scientists to say that, or physicists to say that this is their discovery. These notions have been around for a very long time. It's just that alchemy is not entirely a mental thing. It's literally taking existing materials that was created by nature or God, depending on how you want to look at it, and then forging something new out of those things, synthesizing something new. And that is usually an expenditure of energy, whether it be someone pounding that sword and melting those things with fire, or someone creating dissolutions and liquids to make something else occur. And those liquids in most cases are just variations of other elements that have already existed outside of our mind. So it's like the forest doesn't exist until I decide I want to walk into it. And that's the preconception and presumption that I think most people would have. And the reality is those of us who've wandered around before know the serendipity of both discovering something interesting without any predisposition to look for it, as well as in some cases, you're like, man, I was thinking about finding money the other day, and I walked down the sidewalk and a $20 bill blew by, and that's happened, it happens to people too. Okay, so brain in phase. The consciousness process is most easily envisaged if we picture the holographic input with a three-dimensional grid system superimposed over it, such that all of the energy patterns contained within can be described in terms of three-dimensional geometry using mathematics to reduce the data to a two-dimensional form. So there's my grid paper example. Bentoff states that the scientists suspect that the human mind operates on a simple binary go, no-go system, as do all digital computers. Therefore, once it superimposes a three-dimensional matrix over holographic information, it wishes to interpret and reduces that information mathematically to two-dimensional forms. It can completely process it using its fundamental binary systems, just as any computer made by the hand of man can process volumes of data and make various comparisons between the data and information stored in its digital memory. Our minds operate in the same way, perceiving by comparison only. I get what that means. There's actually a study called epistemological assumptions, and it is basically that nothing exists without something to compare it to. Like the baby wouldn't know it's a sword without having a predisposition or being told what it's for. So, but that still doesn't answer it doesn't help that sort of rhetoric that I went through. Bentoff states the proposition this way: our whole reality is constructed by constantly making such comparisons. When we perceive something, we always perceive differences only. That's true. In states of expanded consciousness, the right hemisphere of the human brain, in its holistic, nonlinear, and nonverbal mode of functioning, acts as the primary matrix or receptor for this holographic input. While by operating in phase or coherence with the right brain, the left hemisphere provides the secondary matrix through its binary, computer-like method of functioning to screen further the data by comparison and reduce it to a discrete two-dimensional form. I mean, it really sounds like they're like, I'm looking at a cup here on my desk, and without the shadows and without the light shining on the cup, I wouldn't be able to perceive it as a three-dimensional object. So, right, and I mean literally, like if I were able to illuminate the room in such the way that all shadows were eliminated, the cup would appear as a two-dimensional object, perceptually in real time. But the the three-dimensional component, which I see quite clearly, and I can make out the curves and the bends and the contours of the cup, are inherently dependent on illumination, on photons. So it would be photons, and then I guess, I mean, it's like, again, this electrostatic field or this electromagnetic field or the biofield. It's like the cup should be able to respond to what I either perceive or don't perceive, regardless of a light being on or not. So if I turned off the light and I couldn't see the cup, it's like, is the cup there, right? I mean, or if I can't see the cup, what can I do to my own sight? Do I need to like advance my eyes or evolve with my eyes where I can see different bandwidths, which then would be considered energy, because light is also an energy form. The photons are an energy form. And if I need light to see things just with, let's say, my rudimentary, unadvanced eyesight, as opposed to a computer or, special heat vision goggles or something like that, you hear these. I think a lot of people, if you're listening to this or interested in this, you've heard stories of people being able to see auras or the chakras on people, and they see colors perceived over someone's head, or they see colors over their body parts, and those colors indicate specific things. What we're saying here is, your eyes can eventually get to a state, or your not your eyes, but your entire consciousness can get your eyes to function in such a way that you're perceiving things like a infrared, your X-ray. You can kind of switch it off and on with your own eyes, and that may be what we're talking about, because we do rely we're so dependent on our eyesight, but we're also dependent on the photons to make this object look three-dimensional in the first place. And without those photons, we don't see anything, so there's nothing to perceive. So I know that was a little bit of a mental gymnastic effort, but it helps to talk this out, if you're not able to talk to someone directly about it, and no one's really interested in it that you're surrounded by. I'm just trying to also elaborate and expound my thoughts on this kind of stuff. It's like, it states expounded consciousness, the right hemisphere of the human brain, in its holistic, nonlinear, and nonverbal mode of functioning, acts as the primary matrix or receptor of this holographic input. It's not consciousness that's perceiving things, it's your eyes, right? I mean, that's what most of us would think, if you're just going to say, well, we're materialists, and my eyes are what registers things for me, and then my brain processes the input. To me, that statement sort of nullifies my eyes even functioning, in that my brain as an antenna is doing the reception, and then the eyes are doing the perception, I guess. I'm just trying to formulate an understanding of this all. So I'm actually let's just look at this last paragraph. To extent of gateway succeed. Let's stop here, because this has run a little bit long, and I think there's a lot to think about and process, or do some individual research on, as I continue this video series for Gateway. I'm going to leave it at the evaluation, but scroll through, compare my jumbled explanation to what you read, and if you actually have a better understanding of it, or something that can be referenced, for other people, I'd be interested in seeing that or hearing it. All right. Have a good day.